everybody, to another episode of Quarantined Coaches. This time we're at Morehead State with Coach Mik Aoki. Say that correctly. How are you, sir?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. I appreciate you being on. So Morehead State, where is that? Can you tell me a little bit about that school and that program?
Yeah, Morehead State is located about 45 minutes to the east of Lexington along I-64. So it's like halfway between Lexington and getting to West Virginia. So it's a little mountain town in the, small, pretty rural town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And school has, from a baseball standpoint, this past year was my first year there. Prior to that, Coach McGuire had a good string of success. Had built a nice program in 2019. I think they won 41 games. They had averaged about 37 wins over the previous 4 years. So nice little place to go play baseball and go to school.
So you guys are in the Ohio Valley Conference. What's the history of that conference in terms of success, trips to the College World Series, things of that nature?
Yeah. When you sent me that, I had to do a little searching to see what the deal with that is. I don't think an OVC team has made it to the College World Series. I think the closest it came probably in the current format was Tennessee Tech in 2018, right? So I think they made it to Super Regional. They won Game 1 against Texas, I believe, and then I think they lost 2, and that was the last time that Texas went to the CWS. Prior to that, you have to go back to when the regionals were like these, 6 teams in 14 different sites or whatever. And I think the closest was Western Kentucky was a member of the OVC, and they lost in the championship game, I believe, of that particular regional.
So, this was something I touched on the other day with a coach who had been through a bunch of the levels like you had. Do you feel that you have a fair shot to make it to Omaha?
Fair. I guess it would depend on what you mean by fair, right? If you say, hey, you have a shot, so that's fair, then we have a fair shot. I would consider it probably like it's a puncher's shot, right? It's Rocky catching Apollo Creed with the right hook or something like that is really what it is. You kind of catch lightning in a bottle, a little bit like Stony Brook did a few years ago, maybe a little bit like Kent State did, although Kent State has sort of stood the test of time in terms of success over the years. But I think it's just one of those, you kind of get hot, and you get hot at the right time. And probably with a mid-major and OVC, you have to be a little older. You have to have a roster that's made up of juniors and seniors.
Well, anything that to me, that sounds unfair. So based on my definition of fair, why is there this divide within just the Division I teams?
I think you have it, even if you even like kind of drill down into it. I think you even have it within conferences, right? I mean, I think you look at any conference and you have kind of a history of sort of the haves and a little bit of a history of the have-nots, so to speak. I think one of the beautiful things about the OVC is that you don't necessarily have that at like quite the level that you do in some of the other conferences, right? But I just think to a certain extent, it's just what a school is willing to do, and the price, because resources, money, bricks and mortar really play a huge part into it of, are we willing to put this sort of thing into it? And then I think the final thing with baseball is geography has a little something to do with it too. That the southern schools and the system that it is have a built-in advantage, and starting playing baseball in the middle of February gives them a pretty sizable advantage on the whole thing.
So you mentioned, what kind of resources can be put into the program. I think we all think resources is money. Is that the only thing that resources consists of?
I mean, it's really it's the biggest thing for sure, I think. But I think that as you look at schools and you look at sort of the academic side of the school and what that level of academics is for that particular school, I think then the other part of it that comes in is, who are you willing to admit, right? It doesn't matter how good a player you are. You could be the next coming of Alex Rodriguez. And if you're a 3.0 and a 22 on your ACT, which isn't a terrible student, you're not getting into Harvard, right? I mean, you're just not. And so they don't even bother to recruit you. And so it's, and I think you have different levels of that. I mean, you certainly look at some schools around the country with really good academic reputations that are willing to bend a lot more to get their student athletes than some other places are. You know, you look at places like Vanderbilt and Michigan and UNC and UVA. I mean, I think by anybody's standard, those are some of the top academic institutions in the country. But they're not, the kids that they're getting in for athletics are not being held to the same standard of the kids who are getting in, you know, on their own type of thing.
And why would a school be willing to do that?
You know, I think that they want to be in the conversation of competing at the very, very highest level of college baseball. And they have the academic, you know, they have the financial resources, they feel like, in order to do that. And so they're going to try to put that part and parcel along with providing the sort of the human resources part of it, you know, in terms of being able to recruit the very best players that they can get there.
Well, so when you talk about investing in anything, the idea behind investing is getting a return. But baseball is not a money-making sport at the college level, correct? So maybe you can explain that to me a little bit. Are baseball teams making money? And if they're not, what's the point in investing in them?
Well, I mean, I think that there's probably less than a dozen schools in the country that, when you look at the entire ball of wax, from coaches' salaries down to scholarships to operating expenses, I think, that are making money, right? And I would say that there might be 2 or 3 in the Big 12. There might be, you know, maybe 6 to 8 in the SEC, and probably that's about it, you know, in terms of baseball making money. I think to a certain extent, maybe it comes down a little bit to the mission of the university, but I think that one of the things that athletics does is put the university out there, right? When you know, when Vanderbilt is squaring off against Michigan this last year in the College World Series, that's getting their schools some notoriety and some recognition and some free advertising. You know, you might argue that they don't necessarily need that, but it is something that's doing it. You know, and I think that that's the case. That in these, and I think for some other schools, you know, for schools that are maybe of a little bit of a lower brand, if you will, you know, a school like a Coastal Carolina, who, you know, Coach Gilmore has done an unbelievable job with that program for the last, you know, 20 some odd years. But that maybe that they chose baseball because that's the vehicle through which they get it. And they look at some of their other sports and they figure, well, you know, we haven't had quite as much success as this guy has had. So we're going to start to pour some resources into it. You know, to a certain extent, I feel like that was the case with Coach Corbin at Vanderbilt. You know, when he got there, that program took off, and they have continued to invest in that program.
I mean, is that not discouraging for a coach who feels, you know, like, you know, is it unfair or whatever? That question I asked at the beginning, like, is that not discouraging for a coaching staff to feel like, you know, we don't have a fair shot to win it all?
Is it discouraging? That's a good question. I would argue to you that no, not necessarily, right? I would argue to you that if the only reason that you got into coaching is to be able to, you know, that your coaching career wasn't going to be fulfilled without winning the national championship in whatever sport that you know, you're coaching. You know, I don't know that I would want my son or daughter necessarily playing for him or her, right? Because I think that they're going to make some decisions that might be a little bit on the dark side of the line between, you know, right and wrong, right? Because I just think that it's that way. I think that when you first get into coaching, right? Like, I mean, especially for me, if I speak for myself, you get into it, you're just like, well, Jesus, baseball is the only darn thing that I've ever done. I like playing baseball. I don't want to go get a real job, so I'm just going to continue to do this stuff. And then I think as you mature into it, your goals become a little bit more about, you know, developing young men in our case, right? Or for young women, for people who are coaching that female sports. But I think it's about that part of it. I think it's about, you know, you maybe change to see like, hey, success is defined by maybe getting the very most that you could have possibly gotten out of a particular player, right? And that's not to say that you don't want to win and lose, right? I mean, you do. You want to, There's not a guy who enters into the baseball profession at the college level who doesn't want to go play in Omaha. Not one, you know. And if you ever lose that drive, then I would say to you that you should probably get out of the deal, you know. But at the end of the day, I think you can define success by trying to impact kids' lives in the most positive way you can.
It's got to be frustrating though, I would imagine at times, because success breeds success, right? You do
Mhm.
well, and then you're going to get the better kids wanting to go there, right? Or the more talented kids, at least on paper, before they get there. You know, isn't that frustrating to you, where you feel like maybe you might be a better match, or you have more to offer a kid, but yet the kid goes for, you know, the place that might be more flashy? I mean, that's an uphill battle, is it not?
Yeah, but I think that that problem exists regardless of where you are, right? Um, I think that, you know, Paul Maneri, you know, loses out on a recruit to Florida, and he's probably like, well, what, you know, but, you know, whatever, that they have this advantage or that advantage or whatever the heck it might be, right? If Sully loses a guy to, you know, to Corbs at Vandy, it might be this, that, you know, it's this and that. I think that that problem exists anywhere. I think that there's enough players out in the world that are the right fit for your program from a talent standpoint, from a makeup standpoint, and all those different types of things, that I think that you can craft, you know, a really competitive team out of it. And like I said, if you're at a place like the OVC, or if you're playing in the Ivy League, or you're playing in, you know, the Horizon or the Summit, or all these different types of leagues out there, right? Yeah, you still get that fighter's chance, and you're still kind of looking for it. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, the value of athletics is as much about the journey as it is about the outcome, right? So,
The idea, I've heard it a lot from coaches, the idea in recruiting is to recruit somebody that is at least projected to be more talented than whoever's at the middle of your roster right now. That's how you get better.
yeah.
Uh, so how do you do that when you are a mid-major? Like, how do you recruit somebody than what your average roster looks like when you're up against so much competition?
Um, I think you rely a little bit on experience, right? Of seeing the way that maybe particular types of athletes, particular types of bodies, particular kids from particular regions maybe sort of have that development track. I think it's difficult. It's certainly not an easy part of it, right? But I also think that at the end of the day, you believe in your own sort of development strategy for kids, both from a academic standpoint, an athletic standpoint, and sort of a personal growth standpoint. The kids who buy into that kind of stuff, they get better. They do, you know. Does that mean that they end up being all Americans or first round draft picks? You know, not all the time, without any question, not all the time, right? Because it's not a science, but you go out there and you try to find the very best fit that you can for your program.
So many kids are just, in families, are caught up with, let me go to the best team possible. You know, like I've heard it so much when telling a recruit to look at a certain program, the first thing they look at is the wins and losses of
Mhm.
a program, right? So for a Division One team, let's say, that's on the lower end of those rankings out of the 299, I think it is, that exist, you know, what's the selling point?
I mean, I think there's a lot of selling points, right? I mean, at the end of it all, right? I mean, we should all sort of be selling the fact that, hey, we're going to try to get you better as a player. We're going to try to get you better as a person. We're going to try to get you better as a student, right? I think when you talk about recruiting, and the frustrating piece, I think over the years has been, as early recruiting has gotten more and more prevalent, and I know that the NCAA is trying to put the brakes on that, because you got 14-year-old kids making decisions about where they're going to be in school 4 and 5 years from now, right? And that's ridiculous, right? Because they're going to go to the shiniest thing, the shiniest object is what they're going to get caught up in. Not necessarily is it the right fit for them, right? You know, when you have schools that are signing 18 kids a year, if you do the math on those kids, there's not 72 kids on that team's roster, right? And I know that some of those places lose a handful of guys to the draft every year, and there's some coming and going. But at the end of the day, even if 9 of those guys are showing up every year, right? There's some cutting and some trimming of the program that's happening. And is that something that you want to sort of get caught up in? You know, and I think it's that part is tough, but I think that there's a fit for all of that stuff. At the end of the day, the kids should be getting a degree. have gotten smarter, have gotten better prepared for life, all those different types of things. And if the coach is doing a good job with that sort of thing and the university is doing a good job, it doesn't matter if it's the 290th school in the country or the first school in the country from a baseball standpoint.
I think it might be fair to say that right away, it's natural for a young guy to look at the shiniest object, right?
Yeah.
And be enamored when they're young by who's on TV, who's got the coolest clubhouse, the coolest uniforms, that kind of thing. You know, where is kind of the tipping point where families and kids should maybe start to recognize there's more important things to look at, and what are those more important things to look at?
Well, I mean, I think probably at some level or another, kids need to get like bludgeoned over the head over like, what's the chance of you making it to the big leagues, right? Because when you're a 14-year-old kid, like, and every 14-year-old kid should be like, hey, I want to get to the big leagues, and I'm working my rear end off to get to the big leagues. And nobody should ever be able to take that dream away from that kid if that's what it is that he wants to pursue. And so what's my best route to it? All right, my best route might be to go to that like really shiny, you know, place with the best facilities and the cool clubhouse and the best win-loss records, and they're in Omaha, you know, on a relatively normal basis and all that kind of stuff, right? But at the end of it all, right, those guys that make it to the big leagues, I mean, it's only like 6% of anybody who ever signs a pro contract who makes it to the big leagues for a day, for one day, right? So baseball probably isn't going to be the thing that ultimately puts bread on your table for the next 45 years, right? Or longer. And so I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive. Like, I think you need to go find the very best baseball place that you can play at. And I think you can go try to find the very best academic place that you can play at. And I don't think they need to be like mutually exclusive things that you're looking for. And so it's kind of like, hey, this is my dream, but this is my backup plan, right? It's like life insurance. I don't want to die, but I have life insurance in the event that, you know, tomorrow I get hit by a car or a damn coronavirus, you know? So it's, I mean, I think you got to have a backup plan in life. And I think the backup plan is the educational and personal development piece that I think colleges can offer. So find the place ultimately that allows you to play at the very highest level that you can and allows you to get the very best educational and personal growth experience that you can.
So if you're up against, you know, one of these big time programs for a recruit, how do you win that recruit?
Honestly, at the end of the day, it probably means that like they're offering them a walk-on spot, right? And we're offering them a big chunk of money, right? That's probably the way that you're gonna. Or I think, lastly, and you know, this one is, I think, really, really important too. I think you can be cavalier about the money component of it, but I think it's really important to create a relationship with them, you know, and I think that that's really, really important. I mean, I remember, you know, way back before like the early recruiting days, right? And we'll give like a little shout out here to Coach Strickland at Georgia, and he was an assistant at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt wasn't the Vanderbilt that we think of now, right? They were, you know, kind of a perpetual sort of bottom half of the SEC. They hadn't got the stadium built yet. Coach Mewborn hadn't built that thing yet. And, you know, Strick had done an unbelievable job of building a relationship with Jeremy Stowers, right? Who at the time was one of the most sought after pitchers in the country. And so he ends up going to Vandy, right? And if it weren't for that, I mean, it wasn't like, you know, that kid had an opportunity to go anywhere in the country. He could have written his ticket to anywhere, right? And he went to, you know, kind of a place that might have been a little bit of an upset from a recruiting standpoint. And he did it because Strick spent the time and developed a relationship with the kid and with the parents. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, Strick sort of made it his mission in life for one summer to make sure that Stowers ended up at Vanderbilt. And he did.
Can these schools, like, I mean, does it happen where you're playing this financial game where a school is able to just absolutely break your budget because they can offer a walk-on spot, which then forces you into having to offer a very large scholarship, and then, you know, your budget's put in a bad position for recruiting other players? I mean, does that happen, or is it not that crazy?
I don't think it's probably that crazy. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, The fact of the matter is that there's a difference in the level of play between the SEC and the OVC. That doesn't mean that on any given day that an OVC team can't walk into a SEC school's place and beat them, because it can, right? Again, I think that's a differentiating factor for baseball rather than basketball, or certainly football. You know what I mean? It's just because of the physicality of all of that type of stuff. And all you need is like one hot guy on the mound on a particular day, and you can probably beat just about anybody in the country. But I do think that it just, if let's say Tennessee, for example, is offering some kid, hey, we got a preferred walk-on spot for you, and we're offering them 50 or 60% to come to school. We're still not going to go over and above what it is that we feel like, we're not going to go to a full scholarship to just try to get that kid, unless we feel that the kid is a full scholarship type of kid, right? And if he is a full scholarship type of kid, I would like to think that Tennessee is offering him more than a walk-on spot,
Right. I mean, do you think it's very interesting to me, the dynamics of the whole thing. Is this just the way it is, or do you think that we need to create a situation where there is more parity, or this is the way it is and it works fine?
I think, your underlying premise is that it's not fair, right? So I think that you look
correct. Like, exactly. Like, is it fair? And I know you kind of go back to that question. I guess a better question is, do you feel like we can do better or create more parity, and how would we do that?
Could we do better? Yeah. I think the simple answer is yes. I think you could. But I still think that regardless of even if we did a little bit better, there's just inequity in that, right? There's inequity in every system. There's inequity in whatever, if it's, if we're talking about competing for the national championship in football, right? There's inequity there. There's certain places that they just have it built in, for whatever the reasons are, that they're going to be a little bit more attractive to the kids that are coming out. They're going to be, they've sort of stood the test of time. And I don't know that you're going to sort of get away from that part of it. Could we do a little bit better? Yeah. I think things like, if baseball were a head count sport as opposed to an equivalency sport, then kids are making decisions based on the school and the coach and the right fit for them. And the money part of it is sort of taken out of the mix. And I think that would be a good first step. Explain
that part for young guys who are just hearing this, head count versus equivalency.
So a head count is basically like 1A in my old guy parlance, right? Or so like the BCS or the FBS, right? The highest level of college football. Every one of those guys that has a scholarship is on a full scholarship. Everything's taken care of. So that in a head count sport, everything that's a scholarship is a full scholarship. In an equivalency sport, we're allowed to sort of chop them up however we want. Now, baseball has the unique standing that we have to, if we're going to offer a scholarship, we have to offer 25% minimum. No other sport has that in the NCAA. But we can offer you 30%, we can offer you 40%, 50%, a full, whatever it is. You add up all those decimal points, and in any given year, we can't be over 11.7 in our scholarships, is basically what it comes down to, right?
Do you think college baseball will become a profitable college sport at some point down the road?
I think there's a small handful of places that can do it, right? Really small. And again, I think it's all about the geography as far as that one goes, right? I love baseball, and there are so many people who love baseball. And clearly with what you've been doing, you love baseball, but I think that you would be challenged to want to go see a baseball game between whoever. Pick your most your most sort of coveted matchup. And if it's 38 degrees with a light mist, you're probably going to be like, you know what? I think I'll just stay at home and watch this in the comfort of my couch, right? College summer leagues are making money. There's a lot of them that are making money, and they have an unbelievable product to sell during the course of the summer. I know Coach Mazey at West Virginia has been sort of like beating this drum for a while, and I just feel like if we're going to make money across the board at most places at Division I baseball, the season has to back up to where we're playing kind of through the summer. We've got to be playing from like April to August or something like that.
you guys are probably, I say you guys, mid-major schools are probably going to benefit from this extra year of eligibility. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how this is going to play out. It's really kind of interesting to me, right? Every mid-major is going to get a little bit older, but so is probably, sort of the top of the run too, especially if the draft happens later, right? And so that if MLB goes to 5 rounds as opposed to 9 or even 10, which might be the max for this year, that's going to take fewer guys out of the pipeline if it's closer to 5. And so some of those kids just might end up coming back to school. Some of those freshmen that they anticipated being drafted might show up to school. I think JUCOs are going to get a serious bump out of this deal. But I do think the mid majors will benefit from this a little bit, right? It all of a sudden, now all of our freshmen have gotten a little bit of game competition under their belt. They kind of know what it looks like. So now you have like up to 5 classes that have some experience. I think that can be a pretty big deal. Yeah.
I mean, are mid majors expecting to get quite a bit of kickbacks from the? I know you hate the term Power Five because it's not really Power Five conferences necessarily have those
Right.
outliers, but are you expecting mid majors to see that the guys who are at those ACC, SEC teams, coming back down to mid majors?
I think you might see a lot of the grad transfers. I think that's where you might see it, right? Because I think that, the schools at the upper echelon of college baseball, that they just might not be able to pay for those seniors coming back, right? They just might, because you're thinking about, you have to have an eye on this year if you're there, but you also have to have a little bit of an eye on 21, 22, because you got to get back to 11.7 at that point. So I think there could be like a serious market for the transfer, kickback, grad transfer thing for probably the next 2 or 3 years, which I do think probably benefits the parity piece throughout college baseball.
How has your recruiting plan changed based off of what's happening now with the virus and this year's shutdown? For example, were you looking at, the 2021 class and now that's on hold, or how is your plan going forward changed than what you anticipated your recruiting plan looking like 6 weeks ago?
Well, we thought we were going to have still like quite a bit of work to do in the 20 class, right? And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, all of our seniors, I think, are coming back. I think 7 kids that we had signed in the fall are coming to school. And so outside of a couple of like left-handed pitchers at this point, we just don't feel like there's anything more to take. I do think that it's going to be interesting, and this is a choice that's going to be somewhat dictated by our athletic department or maybe even the OVC, is, all of these kids who just got their year of eligibility back, we're still sort of, for the most part, kind of on like a 4-year agreement as far as their scholarships go, right? And so what do you do for the kid who's a junior? He's like an actual senior, right? But he has still like 1 more year, and you've paid him out. You feel like we've upheld our end of the 4-year contract for that kid. What do we do for him in his 5th year? And so I think some of those discussions have to happen probably in the next month or so to figure out what we are doing with the 21 class.
I've heard from a lot of guys, and I'm just trying to figure out it. Everybody's different, like we're talking about here today, and get a gauge on how different it is for each team. I've heard a lot of guys say for the 2021 class, that was the group that the Division I teams were starting to lock in on and follow them this spring, and then get out there, watch them put offers out over the summer. That group now is on complete hold, and they feel like they're really not going to have a good idea or a full understanding of what they need in that class until possibly as late as December or January. Is that anything? Have you heard any of that, or is that kind of a situation you feel like you're in?
I think that's totally a situation that we're in. I think that's different as I once heard like recruiting described as kind of like a mushroom cloud, right? And so at the very top of the cloud, you've got like that, whatever your power five or that upper echelon of college baseball. And for by and large, they sort of take like their recruits, and then that next level kind of has to sort of wait in the wings and take there, and then that next level, and it sort of mushrooms out type of spot, right? And so if we're somewhere in the middle of that mushroom cloud, I think that we have to kind of see what they do, because I think there's going to be some kids from the top of that upper echelon in that 21 class and even into the 22 class that they'll probably cut loose here in probably in the next 6 to 12 months. Is like they had a verbal commitment from them a year ago or 2 years ago, and as they see guys coming back, and this guy maybe not going to get drafted, and we got to take care of this kid and this and that. I think some of those like committed kids, you're going to start to see some of those guys get cut loose, and that's going to sort of set off this like little round of recruiting, and it kind of mushrooms down. Yeah.
What are you typically able to figure out during a spring that allows you to then recruit in the summer? And see if I can word this correctly for you, but you didn't get a chance this year to figure it out in the spring. Like, what is it that's delaying that timeline as it would usually go? Because it's crazy to talk about, Division I teams. And I've talked to ACC and SEC teams that agree that they'll be recruiting seniors next year who are just 4 or 5 months away from graduating, which is really unheard of.
Right.
What are the factors that cause that delay? Like, what is it that coaches need to figure out before they know what they're going to go after in that group?
Well, I mean, I think a big deal of it is like who ends up showing up in that freshman class this year, who ends up coming back. We're talking about an abbreviated draft next year too, right? We're talking about a minimum of 10 rounds and a maximum of 20. So that just puts more kids into the college pipeline than it has been in the past. It also takes fewer kids out of college than it has been in the past. And so, I think that makes it that much more difficult to sort of project what the next couple of years look like from a recruiting standpoint, right? Because that kid that's a junior that you think might sign in the 15th or 16th round, well, maybe he kind of, because there's only going to be 20 rounds or something, maybe he ends up coming back to you, and you'd rather have that kid, right, for another year than the high school kid coming in.
Where do you feel like you missed out this spring from an evaluation of your roster standpoint? Like, I'm imagining you used the spring to see kind of what your younger guys look like or what you could expect going forward, like, or you got a good enough idea in the fall? Like, how much did losing the spring impact what you know about your team going forward?
I think a pretty decent amount, actually, because I think that our weather is a little hit or miss in February, right? So we didn't really play midweek games in February. We had only, I think, played like I think maybe 1 or 2 midweek games. And those 1 or 2 midweek games are those guys that are maybe your younger guys, or your guys that are 6, 7, 8, 9, and you're on the pitching end of things, and you don't really have a great sense of who or what they're capable of doing. You don't get a sense of like what their sort of trajectory in terms of development looks like, all that kind of stuff. And it's the same for your position group too, the position group that weren't, in that starting core of guys, the guys that are your 10th, 11th, 12th bat, or you don't really know them, and you don't really know them.
So would it be fair to say that that's part of the holdup and part of the delay that's going to take place, is you need to evaluate what you have? You didn't get enough time to necessarily do that.
100%, 100%. And I think it's also, to me, I think like the freshman year in college is, some kids, there's a small handful of kids who make that transition really seamlessly, but I think most of them really struggle with it. And for those kids, you never got a chance to see what they were in February to what they became in May.
Coach Aoki, really interesting talk. I appreciate you diving into some things that, some people might not want to dive into, but it's just, it's the game. I think college baseball is a great game. Personally, like you said, there's inequities in everything in life. Hell, the Yankees have more of a shot every year than most teams. So
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
you're not going to change that kind of thing. But I commend you for coming on here and not being scared to talk about that. And it does mean a lot. I think just the more education, the more everybody understands the game and the dynamics of every part of the game, the better the game's going to be. So thanks for coming on here and talking about that today.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And thanks for doing this stuff. All of us guys that are, living on Twitter and looking for stuff like this are really thankful that you're doing it.